Someone you love is going to die. Maybe they already have. And when that moment came, or when it comes, you will do something strange. You will gather. You will speak. You will prepare the body with your hands. You will bury objects alongside someone who can no longer use them. You will cry in public, in front of other people, and no one will tell you to stop. You think of this as grief. You think of it as a tradition. But what you are actually doing is something your ancestors were doing 300,000 years before you were born. And the real story of why you do it is far stranger than you think. Here is what most people get wrong about death rituals. They assume they are religious. They assume someone, at some point, invented them. A priest, a king, a prophet. Some authority who decided this is how the dead must be honored. But the archaeological record tells a completely different story. Long before religion, long before kings, long before language may have even existed in its modern form, your ancestors were already burying their dead with intention. And that single fact changes everything you think you know about what it means to be human. In 2015, a team of researchers led by paleoanthropologist Lee Berger made a discovery deep inside a cave system in South Africa called the Rising Star Cave. What they found inside, in a chamber accessible only through a passage so narrow that the excavators had to be specially selected for their small frame, were the remains of a previously unknown species of human relative. They called it Homo naledi, and buried alongside those bones, arranged in ways that could not have been accidental, were tools, objects, things placed with the dead. Homo naledi had a brain roughly 1/3 the size of yours. It was not modern, it was not Homo sapiens, and yet it was already doing something that you still do today. Stop and hold that for a moment. A creature with a brain smaller than your fist, walking the earth over 200,000 years ago, was choosing to mark death as different, as significant, as something requiring a response beyond simply walking away. Why? That is the question that should keep you up at night. And the answer begins much earlier than you might expect. Go back further. About 430,000 years ago, in a site in northern Spain called the Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, researchers excavating an almost inaccessible underground chamber found the skeletal remains of at least 28 individuals. They were not prey animals dragged there by predators. There were no tooth marks, no signs of a catastrophic event. Anthropologist Juan Luis Arzuaga, who spent decades studying this site, concluded that the bodies had been deliberately deposited there, carried, placed, by a species called Homo heidelbergensis, an ancestor to both Neanderthals and to you. In that same pit, researchers found a single hand axe. It was made from a red quartzite, a material not found anywhere near that location. It was not a practical tool. It was too beautiful to be practical. It had been crafted, carried from somewhere else, and left with the dead. That axe is one of the oldest known grave goods in the history of your species, and someone made a deliberate choice to put it there. Now ask yourself something. What would possess a creature before writing, before agriculture, before the wheel, before any of the things you call civilization, to carry a beautiful red stone to an underground chamber and leave it with someone who could no longer hold it? The short answer is the same thing that possesses you. Anthropologist Barbara King, who wrote the book Evolving God and spent years studying grief in non-human animals, argues that the emotional scaffolding for mourning runs much deeper than the human lineage. She documented chimpanzees sitting beside their dead for hours, refusing to leave. Elephants returning year after year to the bones of their dead, touching them with their trunks, crows gathering in silent clusters near their fallen. King called these behaviors proto-grief, not identical to human mourning, but built on the same biological foundation, the same neural architecture, the same attachment system that, when severed, creates anguish. Your brain did not invent grief, it inherited it. But something happened along the evolutionary path that transformed proto-grief into ritual, into intentional behavior, and the key appears to be the moment your ancestors began to understand what death actually meant. Cognitive archaeologist Francesco D'Errico, who studies the emergence of symbolic thinking in early humans, argues that true burial behavior with objects, with arrangement, with clear intent, requires a specific cognitive leap. You have to understand that the dead person will not return. You have to hold their absence as a permanent fact, and you have to care about that permanence enough to do something about it. That is not a simple cognitive task. It requires theory of mind, the ability to model another person's inner world, to know that they had experiences, attachments, a life, and that those things are now extinguished. It requires a concept of the future, an understanding that tomorrow they will still be gone, and the day after that, and forever. And it requires what D'Errico calls symbolic capacity, the ability to make an object mean something beyond its physical function. A red stone is just a stone, until you choose to make it a farewell. The Neanderthals, who you have probably been taught to think of as primitive brutes, appear to have had all of this. At the site of Shanidar Cave in Iraq, excavated by Ralph Solecki in the 1950s and 1960s, researchers found Neanderthal burials that included what appeared to be flower pollen. Solecki proposed that the dead had been laid to rest on a bed of flowers. This interpretation has been debated, re-examined, and partially complicated by later researchers who noted that burrowing rodents may have introduced some of the pollen. But what has never been successfully disputed is that Neanderthal burial was intentional. The bodies were placed in particular positions. They were not dumped. They were arranged. A Neanderthal crouching over a body in a cave 50,000 years ago, doing something that looks remarkably like what you do in a funeral home today. Now, go forward in time, past the Neanderthals, past Homo naledi, into the era of anatomically modern humans, roughly 50,000 years ago, when burial practice begins to explode in complexity and variety. Ochre-covered bodies in South Africa, shell beads placed on the dead in Morocco, ivory ornaments in Siberia, children buried with elaborate grave goods in Sungir, Russia, about 30,000 years ago, their tiny bodies covered in thousands of hand-carved mammoth ivory beads beside spears made from straightened mammoth tusk. The labor required to make those beads alone, researchers estimate, would have taken tens of thousands of hours. A community poured that effort into honoring 2 children who had died. Think about that. People who woke up every day fighting for survival, who had no surplus of time, who faced predators and starvation and cold, chose to spend tens of thousands of hours making beautiful things for the dead. Not because it was practical, because it was necessary. And that necessity, that compulsion to respond to death with meaning and labor and ceremony, is something you still carry. It runs in you at a level below culture, below religion, below language. When someone dies and you feel the pull to gather, to speak, to prepare, to mark the moment as different from all other moments, you are not following a tradition someone invented. You are following something much older. A biological imperative wrapped in cultural form, but underneath it, something ancient and animal and unbroken across hundreds of thousands of years. Researchers who study the psychology of mourning, including psychologist George Bonanno at Columbia University, who has spent decades studying bereavement, have found that humans are remarkably resilient in grief, but only when they are allowed to perform it. When ritual is present, when